Hello, my name is Dave Ferguson, and I want to welcome you to our exponential webinar. I am excited about what we're going to talk about today. In fact, I think today's it's kind of one of my favorite topics, and I got a couple of my favorite people with me, so this is going to be fun. For 2026, our theme is good, great, and greater. It's based on John chapter 14, verse 12, where Jesus says, it's just kind of a crazy thing to actually imagine him looking at his followers, disciples in the eyes and going like, hey, the things you've seen me do, you're going to do even greater things than these. And we're exploring that in a number of different ways. What does it mean to have experienced greater things in our leadership, greater things in our church, greater things in our city? And today we're going to talk about that second one, greater things for your church. And we have with us as our guest JD Greear. JD is the lead pastor of the Summit Church in Raleigh-Durham. And he's got a bio that's like half a page here. So I'm only going to give you the most important things. And here's the thing I love the most. All right. Has over 10 third generation church plants. And maybe it's more since then, but over 10, I want to hear more about that. And has a dream and a vision, and I want to hear more about this too, to plant 1,000 brand new churches by the year 2050. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he's got that focus on the United States, and we should talk about that as well.
Yep.
Lots to talk about. Also, and this will be a good segue, I think you just finished up not too long ago doing a series for Right Now Media Pastors Plus called The Multiplying Church, which will be a lot about what we're going to talk about. And speaking of Right Now Media, we have my friend who's going to be our co-host, Brian Mosley. Brian is the CEO and president of Right Now Media, oversees close to 200 folks there that serve. Last count, I remember over 24,000 churches in the United States, and is really about just doing everything he possibly can to make churches successful, to help make church leaders and pastors, their teams successful. And this new thing that they're doing, and I got to be a part of it as well, and I'm excited about it. The Pastor Plus series is all about trying to equip pastors and their staff teams. But what we want to do during this time too, Brian and I are going to kind of co-host it, and we're gonna drill JD. We're going to get every ounce of wisdom out of this guy. But I know that you have your own questions, and that's why so many of you registered for this. So as you do, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and you can start putting them in now if you already maybe read some of JD's books or other things, or you've heard him speak. You can put those in there. We would love to make sure we address your questions, not just the ones that Brian and I want to ask him. So if you put some in there, we'll try to make time for that. We're going to go 45 minutes to an hour here, and I'm excited about this time together. So I'll tell you what, let's back up a little bit. And JD, I'll start with this. So John 14:12, Jesus says, greater things than these. What does that look like when you take what he's saying there to his followers, which really were the first church? What does that mean? What does that look like in our churches? Do you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you sort of alluded to it there in the way you kind of set it up, is there's almost a comic absurdity to it when you think about what that must have felt like to those first disciples. Because even if you discount all the miracles, like let's just take off the table, raising Lazarus from the dead and walking on water and all that stuff. And you just think about like the normal ministry. Who on this webinar has ever counseled a woman with greater insight than Jesus counseled the woman in John 4? Who's ever prayed, had a prayer session that was more in tune with the heart of God than John 17? Who is it that has ever taken a more powerful, John Mark Comer 40 days in the desert, retreat, than Jesus? So is there anything I've ever done that was great? And the answer is, of course not. So Jesus wasn't being absurd. And theologians tell us that there's a dimension of greater there that is qualitative, and it has to do with the power of the Holy Spirit in us, and the live dynamic activity. But then there's also a quantitative dimension to that, where Jesus is saying that the multiplied power of the Holy Spirit on the hearts of every believer is going to be greater than if that power stayed concentrated on one leader, even if that leader was Jesus himself, which is a pretty staggering thought, that if we had to choose between having Jesus still on earth, which who wouldn't love that, or
Right.
having the Holy Spirit here, Jesus is saying you actually would choose the Holy Spirit if you recognize the impact of that. How we have pursued church growth in our country, particularly, Dave, it
Yeah.
kind of turns that principle on its head. And please, listen, I'm not a big church hater. I mean, the church that I pastor is, got size to it. So I'm not a hater of that. But we flipped it on its head because we celebrate success as merely the size of our audience rather than the amount of leaders that we're raising up in the fullness of the Holy Spirit.
Let's just go there for just a second, because I mean, because you're talking about exactly where we're headed with this whole theme is really about kind of scoreboard, to use kind of just a practical term. So if you change the scoreboard, what does that look like to change the scoreboard from? And I think this is in your I think I'm quoting you, to change the emphasis from seating capacity to sending capacity.
Yeah. So, we always say at our church, we want to measure our success not by our seating capacity, but by our sending capacity. That leadership is not measured by what we accomplish, but by how many people that we empower. And I want to be very careful not to pit these two things against each other as if you can either pursue growth or multiplication. I actually think our growth actually enables our multiplication. Because so I'm not trying to pit them against each other. I'm just saying that the long-term residual effect of where you get the greatest impact and multiplied thing is when you're raising up leaders. So of all the different things that you're keeping score on in your church, I would advocate that it literally, whether your church is 200 people or 20,000 people, that part of your scoreboard for your leaders, your volunteer leaders, your staff leaders is how many leaders are you raising up? Who's ready to replace you? Who's ready to be sent out from here to either start a new ministry or help start a new church?
Well, and I think even I was kind of joking in the bio, but I picked it out because I love that, because you actually know. No, I know we have at least 10 third generation, church plants.
Right.
That says something about the summit scoreboard. That, I
Mhm.
mean, you could have had in there, and I'm sure maybe it's in there somewhere. We seat this many people every weekend, but even as important or more important is the fact that no, we also have 10 third generation church plants. What are a couple are there other examples of where you've kind of said, you know what, I don't want someone just to be good. I want them to do greater things
Yeah.
in
Well,
more in that kind of quantitative way.
yeah. So I'll use an example from one of our small groups. Small group Sunday school classes, whatever way your church does it. I was having lunch with one of our small group leaders, and he informed me that he had been in a small group, a leader of the same small group for 11 years. And he said, my wife and I, because they're like PhD Chapel Hill, people, so a little bit nerdy. So he has a spreadsheet where all the people that have ever been in a small group listed on that spreadsheet. He says there's 150 of them. In 11 years, we've had 150. He said he holds it. He said these top 10 right here, they're the ones that are currently in there. He goes, of the bottom 140, he said one of them just stopped coming, just kind of fell off. He said the other 139 were sent out either to plant another small group or help be a part of a church plant. Now, this guy's a lay leader, but I'm like, here's a guy that is celebrating and practicing multiplication on, the small group level. To take it down one even more one level, what you want to do that on the individual level with disciple makers. Do you celebrate discipleship growth as growing in your knowledge, growing in your giving, growing in your, whatever it is, activity, or do you measure it also in, are you producing another disciple? Because the vision of the New Testament is not just disciples, it's disciple making disciples. And you've got to, we all know this in churches that you replicate what
No, 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 no. We don't all know this, JD. Say
well,
it,
you
man.
replicate what you celebrate,
That's
right?
right.
And
Right.
so, men celebrate it, you put it, I think there's ways that you can just
Well,
raise the culture.
let me ask a question then, because I mean, that small group example is a great example, because I think there's a lot of churches. I mean, I'm an elder, smaller church, but really it's a normal church outside of Dallas here. We want to be a multiplying mindset at church. We talk about it, but like I think it's hard for some people or groups or churches to kind of get off the starting blocks and like take those first steps. Where does that start, do you think, JD? I mean, what is kind of that practical, like, here's how to get going, or what's that first domino, so to speak?
Yeah, so even if your church is 150 people big and you have one staff member, I know that there's a lot of lay leaders that are there, and I'm sure that you coach those lay leaders in order for them to be able to do their jobs. One of the things we build into the coaching is just a regular check-in on who are you bringing up alongside of you to do this. Because we're committed to church planning, we have a constant need for leaders. And so, with staff, for example, we will ask them, okay, who is there that could either replace you, go out to plant another ministry, or be sent on a church plant? And
Mhm.
everybody's got to, kind of have one of those.
Yeah.
We do that same thing in the volunteer area. On the discipleship level, we do a little strategy called "Who's Your One," and I mean, honestly, it is the most basic evangelism thing that you could imagine.
Mhm.
One person, one that you are intentionally praying for and trying to reach for Jesus.
Hmm.
I mean, I hope that's not the extent of
Yeah.
everybody's but that's the beginning point. And
Yeah.
I think that it's a cult. It's not a strategy as much as it is a culture,
Yeah.
a culture that affects evangelism, leadership, all of it. So
So I
does that
guess,
answer your question?
yeah, I think so. I mean, and I maybe this is obvious, but I guess I'm picking up that the who's your one and like who are you kind of bringing alongside to be sent out or to replace you, like that just becomes a common part of the language, the meetings, the like you said, the culture. It's not like you have to search for that. I mean, you have to keep talking about it, but I guess I'm just saying it must just become, I guess, a part of your normal meeting structure. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. I mean, well, okay, I'll stop saying so Dave won't yell at me. But they say that pastors always overestimate what they can accomplish in 5 years, and they underestimate what they can accomplish in 20. And
Hmm.
the difference between year 5 and year 20 is culture. And a lot of times we come to a seminar like this one, or we go to Exponential, and then we hear some speaker and it lights our fire, and we come home with a strategy, and we try it, and like it didn't work. Well, the reason it didn't work is because that strategy came out of a culture that pastor and that set of leaders had built in that church for a decade. And so what I always want to encourage pastors with is, I mean, yeah, it starts a little slow. And you may not have a whole lot to celebrate after, the first couple of years, but the more that you're talking about it, celebrating it, practicing it on the small group Sunday school level, it begins to infect where it's just like, this is just what we do. We multiply.
Yeah.
You know what? Let's pick up on that. So, am I right about this? So, Summit, you did not plant Summit, right?
I didn't yet.
Yeah, I think until today, I thought you planted Summit. So it was an existing church that was probably in exponential language. What my understanding now about the story really was kind of level two. It had kind of
Oh yeah.
plateaued.
Hmm.
Okay, and now it's clearly moving in level four with dreams and aspirations of level five. Really,
Hmm.
we're reproducing for sure. We want to be that model level five multiplying kind of church. Um, Give us a little bit, because again, kind of speaking to Brian's question, that the average pastor out there, think about your story at Summit, and what are some of the key kind of changes you've made to make that cultural shift, where now it really is a reproducing and really accelerating towards a multiplying church. What are some of the key changes to bring about that kind of culture?
Yeah, yeah. I'll give you a handful here. This is not like the tidiest list, but
Good.
a couple of them were theological and heart based. One of them was just moving from a church focus to a city focused kind of approach. And I started with dreams of building a great big church for God, and wanted to do it for the glory of God. And if I were honest, there was probably a little bit of Gloria JD mixed in there too. But it was just kind of like, let's do this. I mean, the problem with this ministry is it's a great place for people with the idol of success to hide, because you can cloak all your service of your idol and that I'm doing it for the kingdom. But it was very church focused, and I almost it was sort of a crude analogy, but it's almost that we looked at our city like the host culture, that we were sucking up into the church. The city is there for us to grow the church. I started out as a missionary over in Southeast Asia, and I'd gone back to that. After I became a pastor, I went back over there, and I remember going back into the city, and I had all these emotions where I was just like, this was my city. And I was the only gospel witness in this little city in Southeast Asia. And, it was it just felt like I was responsible for the city. And I remember the Holy Spirit saying, why don't you feel that way about your church, your city now? you kind of look at your city as almost incidental. You don't look at it as like, how are we going to reach the city? And I know that seems like a subtle change, but for me, it was monumental because it took me from saying, how are we going to grow one great big church to how are we going to reach the city? And if the way we're going to reach the city is by giving away leaders and sending things out, well, then that's what we're going to be excited about because our scoreboard is ultimately reaching the city, not just growing the church. Growing the church is often good for reaching the city, but sometimes you have to choose between the two of them. And that leads me to the second thing, which was a kingdom focus versus a JD focus. Um, there's a story I love to tell about how I was praying one afternoon for like revival that would come to our city. I mean, the kind that, would just change the face of the city. And I'm not a guy that, God is always whispering in my ear and I'm hearing voices, but it was one of those moments where God spoke in a voice that might as well have been audible. It was so clear and so loud. He was like, all right, what if I say yes to that prayer? And what if I send that revival? But what if I don't use your church to do it? What if it's your church, your buddy's church down the road? Now, Dave, right, I know the right answer to that. Oh, yes, Lord, you must increase and I must decrease. I knew that's the right answer, but that would not have been the real answer. And God had to really break me of this idolatry of success so that we could start to give away leaders instead of holding on to them. And that was, I mean, I would love to tell you that idol is totally behind me. Obviously, I deal with it every day, but it was a line of demarcation where I said, okay, we're going to give away some of our best leaders. Because in case you're listening to this and you're not aware of this, the kind of people that volunteer to go on church plants, they're never sideline people. They're not like, hey, I'm not doing anything. Maybe I should go, do it. It's always your best volunteers. It's your best elders. And it's just every time I have to say, do I really believe this? I mean, you think by this point, I'd be like, oh, this is awesome. But every time I see the people on stage, David, I'm like, oh, that guy, why is that guy leaving? He's so amazing. But
Yeah, he gives so much money, or he's our best drummer.
right, yeah. Not that I know who gives what, but that guy's one of our best givers, and best. Yeah, it's amazing. But here's the thing: most pastors, church leaders listening to this, there's a principle we know how to teach to our people regarding money that we need to apply in relation to our leaders. None of us ever teach our people, hey, if you got extra money you can't figure out what to do with, it's excess laying around, you should give that to God. What we all say is, hey, give your first and your best and watch how God multiplies it and grows it. The same thing applies to us with our leaders. We got to give away sometimes our first and our best because that's the kingdom way. God only multiplies the seed that you sow. He doesn't multiply the seed that you hang on to. And so that, to me was a big shift in doing that. Yeah, I mean, there's probably others that I could highlight, but those are the two or three that really kind of rise to the top when I think about this.
I mean, well, those two are really good there. I mean, one is you got, I need to have a dream that's bigger than just myself. You're talking about the city. And then
Right.
I have to kind of die to myself. And
Right.
in that there is this kind of whole resurrection that happens where God does some things that you never would have expected. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, Dave, I should just for real quick to encourage it, our church, for every one person that we've sent out, our studies show that we have at least 30 new people that are worshiping in a 30 to 1 ROI is a pretty good EROI, eternal return on investment. I know that right now, our church, like we just checked this last Easter, there is more than double the amount of people that are in church every weekend than are at our church. And every year the gap is just going to get bigger and bigger because that's, pardon the use of the term, exponential growth versus just, adding. So,
yeah.
I was going to just chime in. I mean, based on this thought of kind of serving the city, reaching the city, Steve asks a question about how to teach and train your church to be more evangelistic minded. I mean, you talked about the story of the one, who's your one. Like, do you have a class that does that, or what helps to drive, the people in your church to be thinking about those outside of the church and engaging them?
well, the most important thing is almost always the heart of the pastor or whoever does a lot of the teaching, because that kind of stuff really, it's not, I mean, to use the cliche, it's not taught, it really is caught. And when the pastor or the church leaders, they're really excited about reaching people, they just sort of exudes, through that. I mean, every every sermon I preach, I'm thinking about lost people in the community. And sometimes, especially if you're at a smaller church, this is the way you kind of think, well, I know everybody in here. There's no lost people in here. Why should I talk as if they're there? I always say, if you talk to them as if they're there, soon they actually will be there. Because what happens is, Brother Bobby sitting back there, who's a very committed believer, as you're talking to that unbelieving person who's not there, he thinks, my neighbor and I had this exact same conversation. I should bring him next week. So you start talking, you think through your services like that. What I said earlier, you celebrate, you replicate what you celebrate. Make a big deal. We always, when we baptize somebody, if we can, we try to have the person who led them to Christ do the baptizing, because now it allows us to tell two stories, not one. This is not just this person. This person's here because this person, and I'm modeling this while we're celebrating this. That stuff. Yeah, I mean, and just, there's a lot of really good evangelistic churches we soak up everything from. A lot of them are going to be represented exponential. Some of them teach on the Pastors Plus thing or Right Now Media, and just listen to them. And you got eyes, play your eyes when it comes to evangelism.
Hey, we're getting some really good questions in here. So, we want to make sure that we get a chance to ask JD some of your questions here. I'm gonna throw another one out here. We got a couple of questions around rural churches, and I know you're in Raleigh, but I think you're also familiar with rural churches because of the breadth of your work. And this one, this is actually comes from Glenn, but then we also someone else. But I'll kind of try to summarize it. He said, "I'm 6 years old. My first church as a pastor. Been there for 8 months now. We're a rural church in a small community in Nebraska. Lots of people who are farmers and ranchers. We run about 80 people. How do you see how this can happen in that kind of culture? What direction is the key for that culture that I can actually use?" And he goes on to say, "I know the Jesus answer, but I think what he's really looking for, like, what kind of practical things? Yes, we want Jesus to be first and foremost, to be lifted up, but what are some things, some real advice, some coaching you could give him?"
Well, let me actually just first praise the just sort of the humility and the circumspect nature of that, recognizing that not every church is what God does in one church. I mean, the one who had 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talents, they all had different size returns, and Jesus praised the 5 and the 2 talent who doubled them equally. And you just got to be realistic about. We are in a high transit. We have a lot of college students that come to our church, which means every year we have a whole flock of people that are ready to go on church plants, because they're moving anyway. Not everybody has that. I understand that. And so, I think you got to be circumspect about it. But at the same time, you can, there are things that you can do that build multiplication in. Some of them we've already talked about. Some of them, I would go back to when we first started to plant churches. We didn't know what we were doing. I mean, I probably don't know now, but we definitely didn't know then. And so, I mean, I figured out where there was a church planter we could believe in, and I just piggybacked. And it was kind of like NASCAR. Can we put our sticker on your car? How much would it cost to put my label on you? And the church planter, one thing that church planters, we know they love is money. Like I always say, church planters are like teenagers. All they want is your money and your affirmation, and then for you to leave them alone. So these guys would take that, but in return, what happened is our church started to pray about these church planters, and we would start to share stories about them, and they would start to come back and tell us stories, and that infected us until somebody in our church was like, "I actually think we should do that." So in a rural area, there's another community over there that, man, what would it take for us to get something going over there? And maybe it wouldn't look like a full-on church. Maybe it's going to start as a Bible study out there, and maybe we're going to figure out. There are 100 different ways to do this, but they're just ways that you can start to say, multiplying is something that every church does. There's a little historical thing I love to tell Dave, and you probably heard me say it a dozen times. But in the early church, they didn't have any of the stuff that we had. And yet their growth curve in percentage of people in the Roman Empire that were going was just, I mean, it puts ours to shame. And, Rodney Stark, this historian, he says the one thing they had that we don't is they had this understanding that it was responsibility of every church to multiply and every believer to multiply disciples. And, you compare that to the United States, because the United States, we got all these mega churches, and the percentage of people in church in America is going down, not up. And again, hear this, not a hater, not a mega church hater at all. It's just that this strategy over here, this multiplication, is a much more effective strategy than is simply growing mega churches that are amazing in their glitz and their, high dollar entertainment value.
Taking over a level 2 kind of plateaued church, and now, like I think we mentioned at the beginning, there really is this dream. Like, we would love through Summit Church to plant 1,000 churches by 2050 in the United States. What's your latest thinking on that, and how far along are you? How is that going to happen?
Well, if you'd asked me 5 weeks ago, I would have told you we were really, really far along. We're at like 604, I think, is the number. And these are churches that, have come out of our church. The planter or the groups come out. So they're all, they're not just us putting, like I said, putting our label on people. But I don't give that number right now because our domestic church, what we call Summit Collaborative, asked if we could remove all international churches from that number. And so that was about 500 of them. And they said it's just such a different strategy, and we're convinced that we can do this just domestically. So we have a different now kind of celebration thing for the international ones. The domestic churches right now, we've planted, I think the number is 90, maybe 91 now, something like that. And the way that it's supposed to work, and this is what you alluded to in trying to get to the next level, 5, to use exponential terms, there is where each of them begins to have their own residency, where they are now they're recruiting and training their own leaders to be able to do that. Right now, as we've planted these churches, we do a lot of stuff together, and Summit Church has taken a lot of the lead on that. Our goal now, we're starting our second residency this year in a church that we've planted. And then, we've got plans for 3 more in the next 3 years. And then, so now it literally, again, I don't want to overuse the word exponential, but what's happening now is that 80, that 90 some is going to go to, it's just, you know how math works. It's just going to shoot straight up by God's grace,
So basically what I'm hearing is so the residency, which is like your apprenticeship or the way of bringing another person alongside you to plant a church, it has been centralized at Summit. And now what you're going like, okay, if we really want to scale this thing, we want to go from approximately around 100 to 1,000, we need to decentralize this residency.
Yep.
And so now, instead of it just coming out of one place, we're going to have it come out of 3 or 4 different places, at least initially, and maybe more beyond that.
Hopefully, yeah.
I mean, and I think I mean, it's simple, but brilliant. And I think that, even back to Glenn, who asked the question about the rural church too. That's something he could do. If he would bring, someone alongside him and have a resident there, send him out. That you can apply a lot of those same kinds of things, not the same
scale,
kind of scale, but same kind of thing. But I think that's very, very, very exciting.
Yeah, there's an old leadership book, I think you and I've talked about before, Dave, called The Starfish and the Spider.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so they look the same, or at least they're shaped the same. But if you crush the head of a spider, the whole thing dies. If you take a starfish and rip it in two, then you'll have 2 starfish. And the difference is that the DNA for reproduction is in every cell of the starfish, and it's not that way in the spider. And church movements really ought to function more like starfish. Because what we're saying is, my vision of this planting 1,000 churches is not, Summit as this gigantic mother cow and all these little churches that are still, nurse. The vision is that, man, there will be what I always call them big L leaders, like leaders who want to actually lead and don't want to just be my foot soldier. And We'll still do stuff together. We'll come together for college conferences and church leadership conferences, but we're letting them lead. And that means taking hands off and just saying, go, you got the DNA, go multiply.
I think that's so smart, JD, because I don't, how old are you now?
Me?
Yeah.
32.
30.
Or 51, or, something like that.
Somewhere in there. I know, but you remember when you were 32.
Yeah.
And that's what you wanted. You wanted somebody to give you permission. Hey, let me lead at a big level.
Right.
And I think it almost, and unfortunately, or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm projecting now. It takes a certain level of maturation where you finally go like, hold it, there's other people who are like me, and I need to do the best I can to help release them to do the thing. And actually, that's how you get to the 1,000. When you start seeing, 20 years ago, oh, that's what I was like.
Yeah.
I think it's awesome. So way to go.
There's a book. There's another book. I think you and I have talked about this one too, Dave. It's called Multipliers by Liz Wiseman. And
yeah.
oh yeah, right there. Boom. There it is. I don't know, Liz. I don't know if she's a believer or not. The book is not like a church book; it's a business book. But she talks. One of the things she talks about in that book is the illustration of at the height of it, at the apex of its popularity, Jack Welch at GE. There was this crazy number of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies in America that had all been on Jack Welch's staff. And you would almost say like, well, maybe Jack Welch he can't keep good talent. They're always leaving. And she said that would be the exact opposite of the right interpretation. She said that he had such a reputation for raising up the leader. And when it was time, I will help you go to this next level if you can't do it at GE, that it created this leadership vacuum that just leaders flocked to be at their church. I'm not Jack Welch. I'm nowhere near the caliber of leader, but I will say that even on our level, where we're leading, it's almost like we can't give away leaders fast enough. And when we give away 1-3 more pop into the pipeline, because it creates this virtuous cycle of leadership. They're attracted to multiplication. Our worship pastor told me, he said, one thing you pastors don't understand about worship leaders is, he said, no musician ever looks at a group on stage and say, wow, they really stink, I should go help them. He says, but if they see a group that's awesome, they want to go be a part of that. He said that you said, so the greatest musicians will always have an embarrassment of riches. I think the same thing is true for leadership. Like when people see leaders being given away, it brings out the right kind of leader. So I'm like, well, you don't have them. It's because you're not giving them away yet. So give away what you have and watch God replace them.
I think you're
Hey,
right.
JD, can I ask a question that
Yeah.
Lulu, who's listening, asked? And you talked about the residency program. So she's asking, when you talk about residency, does that mean like that they're getting training through you and then you select kind of where they go and lead, or what kind of happens as you release them, or they kind of graduate out?
Yeah, well, I wish they would let me select where they go lead, but they usually, but they no, it's so our the way we do it now is we actually bring people onto our staff and we devote a lot of our energy and resources specifically into training. I mean, that ultimately, I think that's a good goal for people to have. If that's not where you could start right now, it basically starts with, for me, it started with a 6 a.m. Friday morning men's leadership Bible study. Like intentionally, I'd chosen guys that would be there that I could be training up for that. They were all college students. They called it their Thursday night Bible study because it was at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. And they, but out of that group, I think all of them but one are in ministry, and several of them are on our staff now, and that was kind of our early version of a residency, and so I think that there are ways that you can just start that as you increase your capacity as your church grows and your budget grows. Yeah, start diverting part of it. It takes about 65% of our church's income to run our church. That leaves us 35% that we're able to invest in things like this. And part of that goes into that leadership development. Let me, something came into my mind that was really helpful for me in thinking this. This probably goes back to those transitions you were talking about, Dave. There's a principle I learned in the mission field called the heresy of sequentialism. And what it means is that missionally, you start doing things in sequence that God intended to happen all at the same time. And the example would be, you think mission is 301, you think multiplication is 401. So let's start at 101 and work our way up and get to, look at evangelism in the New Testament. In John 4, the woman, she immediately goes out, come see a man that told me all the things that I ever did. Mark 5:19, after the man's freshly been delivered of a demon, Jesus says, go home and tell your friends how great things the Lord has done for you. That was supposed to happen. That wasn't 401, that was 101. And so for churches, it is a crucial mistake to wait till you're at a certain size or budget to start the principles of multiplication. You just start them from the beginning, start building them into your budget, building them into your energy and your calendar, and just say, it's going to look different than it would for a church at 2,000, but here's what it looks like in our church, and here's how I can invest in raising up leaders.
I think that's great advice for church planners. One of my buddies, a guy named Troy, who we sent to Kansas City. I mean, he did it right, much better than I did it. So when they planted, they took with them 3 people who from the day one were leadership residents. So
Hmm.
not only were they planting the church, but they had 3 other people who could actually not only help them plant that church, but then learn from them, learn from
Yep.
the mistakes they were making, because they knew in the next year or 2 or 3 years, they were going to go plant a church. And the result of that, I mean, I think they
Right.
just 15th anniversary. I mean, they've got, I think they've planted like 50 churches in that city and 3 different networks. It's just, and
In
it's
your
not,
in your
it's
in
not
your
a huge
statistic,
church.
well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but in your studies there at Exponential, do you are familiar with I feel like I've heard something that if you don't plant within 5 years, the likelihood of ever planting goes down significantly. Have you ever heard anything like that?
I think we just made that up, but it sounds right.
Okay.
I mean, I
84.2% of
haven't
all
seen this.
statistics are made up
I
on the
haven't
spot.
seen exactly. I'll tell you what, we're gonna get Warren Bird and find that out, because I couldn't verify that based on a research, but just based on my own experience and working with lots of church planners. If you don't get it done in that first 5 to 10 years, it probably is never going to happen. It's always going to be, oh, I wish, someday, I hope.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Probably that culture question, really. I mean, that culture idea, really. You've kind of ingrained a culture that doesn't necessarily push that way. Hey, another question, if I can chime in. Samuel asks about working locally with other pastors and leaders in your city to kind of support that city. What's your experience in that? What's a practical way to try to do that well, or to engage with those other leaders that just, I mean, and I see Dave smiling because he's just chomping at the bit to answer this question too. So
Well, I am chomping to that, but the reason I'm smiling
You
is because
take it.
Warren Bird's actually listening, and Warren just put in the Q&A, hey, I'll find out and get back to you in a second.
there you go.
Good. All right.
Go ahead, answer that question, JD.
Well, yeah, I'd love to hear your take on that too. I mean, in a city, Tim Keller used to talk about the ecology of churches in a city, and I mean, I don't want to minimize doctrinal differences or conviction things, but if you just put those aside for a minute and just think that there are different kinds of churches that engage different brokenness in the city, that engage their different sizes, they minister to people. That used to kind of threaten me because I felt like everybody's church that was different than ours was a verdict that our church wasn't good. And now I realize it's like, no, that's just how God does it. He creates this, and I rejoice when there are people that sometimes leave our church and go to a place where they can thrive more. Just because doesn't mean that I'm terrible as a pastor. It just means that that's a better situation for them. And the only way you can do that, kind of be in touch with that is to know other pastors and to be spending time with them. I do try to make part of my calendar, just whether it's getting lunch or, praying together or stuff like that, is really helpful. A lot of times people have these unrealistic expectations, and we meet every week and we, pray for the city for 2 hours. That's never worked for us. It doesn't work for us to try to do, everything together. Let's just do a big, what we do is there's a few churches that we plant together in our city. We're doing that right now, trying to send 300 people out from our church to go plant a church in another part of our city, and we're doing that with a couple other churches. Sometimes community blessing type things have been really good places for us to do it, and then the occasional large evangelistic thing. Those have been the 3 primary areas that we found it's easiest to cooperate with people on.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Good.
Yeah, what would you say, Dave?
I mean, I am a huge fan of small networks of churches working together in cities. That, I think it was the second option you talked about, how you're working with a couple other churches.
Mm-hmm.
What we have found consistently, that if you bring together 4 to 6 churches, based on 4 to 6 leaders like that, who come together and say, you know what, we want to really accelerate multiplication in our city, in our region, by working together. We found that it actually does 2 things over and over again. One, it's better for those pastors,
Yeah.
because they actually just become friends. And kind
Right.
of you talked about discovering, you're going like, well, yeah, we do have some differences, but man, our similarities are a lot more alike. And we're friends, so we start talking about marriage, we start talking about kids, we start
Yeah.
talking, and so it's good for their own health. It's like
Yeah.
their own small group. But
Yeah.
then the rallying principle is they're saying, hey, we want to plant churches together. And so there's this built-in accountability that, because we're meeting like once a month over a meal, they're actually gonna, okay, we got to do the stuff we've been talking about. And I mean, I could point you in Chicago and San Diego and Kansas City, in Houston and Atlanta. I mean, I can go around the country and there are those kind of things. And candidly, that's part of what I really hope Exponential can really start leaning into is how do we come alongside those kind of leaders who want to come together like that to say, hey, we can do more in this city together.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, talking about Exponential, as long as I got you on here, we got a few more minutes. Let's say you're the CEO of Exponential
Okay.
and you want to not just, and you want Summit to plant 1,000 churches because we need a church. We needed a great example in the United States like that. But you'd love to see it happen, in like every city, not just in Raleigh and all across the country. What 2 or 3 things you go like, man, here's what I would do.
Man, that's a big question. I mean, because I'm a big fan of the current CEO of Exponential, so
Yeah, but he's got a ways to go. So let's help him out.
So yeah, so Exponential has always been, I feel like, at its best when it was in the advocacy lane of church planting. Because I don't think you guys are not, Exponential, and I don't say you guys as if, I mean, because I feel like I do enough with Exponential. I feel like I'm a part of it, but we don't do a lot of planting ourselves. What we're doing is we're advocating, we're championing, we're raising a culture. And for what it's worth, I mean, you got a big W in that column because it was one of the first exposures I had. I think it was Keller and some of those guys at one of those early conferences that really just sort of like, man, it expanded my vision. So I think, just some of those strategic events that bring together sufficiently like-minded churches, different levels of partnership call for different levels of, the theological term is ecumenism, the commonality. And, so not everybody that's in that room at Exponential this year, when I speak there, not everybody in there could Summit Church plant a church with, and they probably wouldn't want to plant with us either, because we'd probably have some arguments about, how we set things up. But, through there, that when the water rises, it's just better for the nation. And so Summit Collaborative is a network of churches, and we have a lot more commonality. Exponential is an advocate. I do that. The other thing is just, man, I hope this doesn't sound too preachy, but I mean, we never, the church plant thing will never outpace our seeking God in prayer. And I would want that to be part of the success formula of Exponential is like, man, if we could raise the prayer temperature in churches. It's interesting that the greatest missionary movement that ever happened when the Apostle Paul left in Acts 13, it didn't come out of a missions conference. Nobody preached a mission sermon that we know of. It says that while they were praying, God raised up. And so just raising that temperature too, advocating for multiplication, advocating for evangelism, advocating for gospel, advocating for prayer. That's what, I would say, keep, pouring gas on that.
That's helpful. I think I'm not even kidding. I think I got a word from God right there. So thank you for that. That's good.
Yeah, well,
I'll tell you, I'm gonna unless you got something, Brian, I want to turn the corner a little bit here. You got anything?
No, go for it.
All right. So with the John 14:12, greater things. And I do think it's about quantitative more, but I also think it's probably also about better, kind of flourishing. And I would say, especially the last couple of years, and that's part of where this theme came from too, was just feeling like, you know what? I mean, candidly, I mean, guys like me and you, yeah, we need to plant more churches, but we got to do better than maybe some of our predecessors have, to avoid creating toxic cultures, to create safe places for people where people know that they're going to be loved, with grace, no matter what. You know what I'm saying?
right.
All right. Kind of leader to leader. You're now, you said 51. You got a long ways to go, but you're probably halfway there. Okay. How are
I'm
you
doing this on 102. That's exactly right.
right? So how are you gonna, you know, be better than some of our predecessors? And I
Yeah.
don't, be a great dad, be the kind of husband that God wants you to be the right friend, follow Jesus relentlessly. I mean,
Right.
what's the plan?
Yeah, I mean, well, you alluded to it. There's nothing that ever, outpaces just your personal character and your walk with the Lord. And I think there's some, I, you know, any of us, I feel like just need to, what Paul says, keep close watch on your life and your doctrine, not just your doctrine, but also your life. Almost every pastor that I feel like gets in trouble, there's in fact, I was with, Paul Tripp, the Christian count wrote Dangerous Calling.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I happened to be with him at some conference. We were back in the green room, and word had just come out on another one of these, mega pastors that had fallen, and it just I knew the guy, and it really kind of hit me, punched me in the gut. You knew him too, Dave, and I just asked Paul. I said, "Man, is there like because he's close to a lot of these guys? Was there like something, that these guys all have in common?" He said, "It's a combination of two things that I see." He said, "Number one is that they lack peer community." He said, "I don't mean like community. They're extroverts. They got big staff, just," he said, "but they lack anybody that actually look them in the face, doesn't, call them pastors, not impressed with them, and just says, you treat your wife, you're kind of a jerk, and you just, the way you are in meetings, you're short with people." Um, and then he said, that's compounded by the second problem is that they forget the power of indwelling sin.
Mm.
And he says, you think that like all this die to yourself, that stuff you got past now that you're a pastor and you're getting older. He says, and man, Satan loves that position because when you get the peer community out, man, out comes this indwelling sin and it destroys you. So this is sort of a long way of saying there's just some old fashioned healthy relationships that I think pastors have to cultivate. Proverbs 18, 18:1 says that an isolated man will always begin to seek his own desire. David Powell, another Christian counselor, said that means that things that grow in a secret garden will always grow mutant. Listen, I'll say it straight. If your accountability is four other guys that you get on a Zoom call once every 3 months and set each other's salary and exchange prayer requests, that is not biblical accountability. There've got to be people that are up close to you enough in your life that they see things that you just don't see. The definition of a blind spot is that you don't see it. A lot of people think, I know my own blind spots. You're like, that by definition isn't blind. It's blind. That's a weakness. That's not a blind spot. But, Ecclesiastes says better is a neighbor nearby than a brother far away, which means it's better to have people that are not exactly at your stature, who are real people who can speak into your life. There's different ways. I will say freely, that's hard when you're a pastor because relationships get weird. But but it's worth it to try to, whether it's other pastors in the area, people outside your church, a right kind of person in your church. I think church government is really important. I know that even on this call, we're going to have different approaches to that, but I would just encourage you to study the New Testament. There's a lot of transferable principles. I believe in a plurality of elder or, that I don't think anybody at the church ought to be Moses. I don't think God intended it to be like that. I lose votes on our elder team and it irritates me every time. But in the big picture, I'm actually grateful for it because I think our elders keep me from, seeking my own desire. We believe just there's a lot of things that can set you up. A toxic person is going to be toxic in any system. But there's a lot of things that the New Testament prescribes when it comes to leadership that can actually limit toxicity and keep it from growing. And I would just say study that and don't treat it like that's a boring seminary discussion. That's actually an important discussion of how to maintain leadership over the long haul. So anyway, I was a little flat-footed on that one. I hope that at least gives you.
I think that was really helpful because what I heard you say is you need a small group of people around you who know the real you, who will call you on your crap.
Right.
And you also need a governance structure that's willing to say no to you.
Right. Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
me and you both know too that, and Brian, you get this because you lead a, it's a medium-sized company there. The more it grows, the more the people around you kind of almost want to say yes to you
Hmm.
because you're the one in charge. You probably sometimes determine how much they get paid or how much influence they have, and so if we don't put those kinds of things in place, like JD's saying, it just makes you more vulnerable. So
Yeah, Larry Osborne, out in California, our
yeah,
friend out there, he said something that is just stuck with me, and I think whatever size church you're at, this applies. He said, the longer you're a pastor somewhere, he said, he says, your relationships with everybody changes and you're the only one who doesn't know it. He said, you kind of think you're just, like you always were. You're one of the guys. And he said, people, especially you've been there a long time, and especially if your church has grown and people start to know who you are. He said, people don't want to disappoint you. They don't want to, and he said, he says, you'll lose touch. You've got to fight against that because it really will lead to, a long-term burnout. So, I guess what
Can
I'm
I
saying
ask
is
you
it's
guys-
worth the effort. Yeah.
So let me ask you guys a question again, thinking about it from the pastoral perspective and that group. Is it, again, so, just picture kind of, small, medium town USA, kind of that average church pastor. Would you encourage that pastor to find some accountability from other like pastors in the community? Or is that more like peer advisory? Like those relationships are helpful, but that's not the accountability side. Like, are those two different groups? Or could it be, hey, there's 4 or 5 of us that are all in pastoral ministry. We're not only holding each other accountable, but we kind of are there to encourage each other and spur each other on because we're in the same space? Or is it better maybe to have folks that aren't in the ministry, world, so to speak, but they're just I don't know. And there may not a right or wrong to that. I'm just curious what your perspective is.
I'd be interested in Dave's answer to that, but my answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
And I know you didn't answer, you asked for me to choose, but
Mhm.
I've just found that like it has to, for most of us, it ends up being a little bit of a portfolio approach.
Mhm.
I do need some friends. I mean, Brian, so Brian and I have been friends for a long time, just worked enough together, and there are things that Brian and I can talk about and that other people and around me don't understand, but Brian understands it because he's dealing with some of the same things. And I love that. I have a handful of relationships like Brian, and that satisfies a real need in my life. Ideally in my head, Brian Mosley lives right across the street and he can see when I'm rude to my wife, but that's just
Yeah, it's
not
not
happening.
reality.
It's
Yeah.
not reality. So I do have a guy across the street who may not match me as much as Brian does in terms of our leadership, kind of questions, but this guy does. We do get together intentionally enough that he's able to look at me and say,
Yeah.
some of those things I said
There's
earlier. So,
proximity there. Yeah.
yeah, Matt Chandler just did a great. It was a podcast. I can't remember the name of it, but it's on his podcast, and he was talking about some relationships that he had, and it was great. But one of the thoughts I had is not everybody's going to have those exact relationships that he's talking about, but they can put together things that will function that. So
Yeah.
it's just not one size fits all. I think there
Yeah.
are ways to get there.
That's good.
Thanks. That's good. Really good. Brian, what's Warren saying? Okay, it looks like Warren Bird got back to us. Let me see if I can get this here. What a great webinar. Okay, he's liking your stuff. Nicely done.
Okay.
He said I just looked at the data from ECFA's New Faces of Church Planning. By the way, if you haven't seen that, I mean, it is for all of our listeners. It is from 2022, but I think it was the largest study ever done. A survey of 2,700 church planners. One question asked how many churches, including daughter and granddaughter churches, they dream of planting in the next 5 years. Those planted in the last 5 years dreamed of 6.5 new churches on average. However, those planted in the last 6 to 12 years said 3 to 4 new churches. Both are great dreams, but more recent planters dreamed about almost double. So
Yeah.
there you go. There's the data to support your point and what I kind of intuited there. So hey,
Yeah,
thank you.
good.
Thank you very much. I didn't know we had a fourth panelist.
A fact checker.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Warren's going to come on after we're done and give like his 10-minute rebuttal to the, I'm just glad that Brian Mosley doesn't have a little thing he's raising up that says false.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I've got it. I just haven't pulled it out yet.
Okay. All right.
That's good.
As we get close to wrapping up here, you kind of know the exponential crowd. And so, I mean, as we're talking about being a multiplying church and doing greater things, both more and better, what things come to mind right now would you like to say to the exponential crowd just going forward on this topic? What advice do you have then? What recommendations?
Yeah. Start small, start where you are. Start with, the Great Commission has one verb in it. It's the word, mathuste or whatever, but it means make disciples. Everything else in that thing that we translate into English as a verb is actually a participle. And, you're like, well, that's a nerdy grammatical lesson. But what it means is that the participle gains its legitimacy and centers around the verb. And what Jesus is saying, just in how he constructed literally the sentence, is the center of everything you do is make disciples. And if you make disciples who make disciples, all this other stuff will take care of itself. if the church got good at discipleship again, then exponential's advocacy becomes a lot easier. It really, the problem with the church planting thing ultimately goes back to a discipleship issue. In fact, knowing we were going to discuss this, I actually jotted down a quote. This is from Francis Chan, which he's spoken at Exponential, right? I think he said this. I don't know if it was at Exponential or not, but he said this years ago. I love this. Long gone are the days when we should be content with a bunch of people who sing out loud, don't divorce, and give to missions. I now want to know I can drop off any member of my church in a city, and that person could grow in Jesus, make disciples, and help start a church. So I would just say to the Exponential crowd, man, let's change our expectations and let's really hope for the greater things. Let's believe that Jesus was not just blowing smoke, that he was actually giving us a game plan when it came to how to see the church surge forward. Maybe just one word of encouragement. I'll say one of my favorite, spiritual vision lines came from St. Andrew in the last episode of The Office. Andy Bernard is who I'm referring to. And Andy said, man, he goes, I wish somebody told you you were in the good old days before you left them. I love that because I look right now at the resurgence of, disciple making and church planting and multiplication through things like Exponential and other things that are going there. The Send Network that I'm a part of they're just doing great things there. And I just say, man, this is like, we're in the good old days. We might see, I love mega churches. I love Billy Graham, humongous crusades. But like I said, that did not net us an increased percentage of Americans going to church. So I thank God for it. But man, if we could add to that now, this reemphasis of multiplication, we might actually see the secularization in America start going the other direction. And with all these immigrants and with all the people, the way America's changing, I mean, we've got a global movement that is happening, and I want to be a part of it. I don't want to miss it. I want to step into it. So we're Exponential crowd. You're alive at a really good time, and so these are the good old days. So lean into them.
There you go. Hey, JD, thanks for being a friend. Thanks for also being a friend to Exponential. Thanks for what you're doing. We're praying for you. I would love to see you and Summit get to 1,000 churches, and then another 500 follow you right after it. And
amazing.
Anything we can do to help. And
what you're doing, man. Thank you.
I think we mean that. And Brian, thanks for the way that you champion the church through Right Now Media and the way you're so passionate. And I know that through personal conversations that you're really passionate about churches being successful at fulfilling the kind of vision that JD just cast for us there. I'll tell you what, I got a couple things I want to let everybody aware of too. JD is one of our mainstay speakers coming up in just a couple weeks here at the Global Conference, and we would love all of you to be there, except we already sold out like last August. So the next best thing is a digital access pass, and we can get you a digital ticket. I think the first 500 of them are going to be $49, and we're not yet to that 500 number. So now is the time, and I think we're going to throw something on the screen here. So I would encourage you, get your digital ticket. And there's going to be some things you'll actually have access to that other folks wouldn't have access to. So it is a really cool thing. I think Will Chung and Aubrey Sampson are going to be hosting that for us. We got a lot of little surprises that are going to be a part of that digital ticket. And also, if you liked the webinar, Brian, you were probably there when JD did the recording for the Multiplying Church for Pastors Plus. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, both of you guys have helped us be a part of this new project. I mean, at Right Now Media, we love serving churches and the pastors of those churches. And so this is a big new effort for us right now, Pastors Plus, which is essentially a series of courses that are designed for the pastor to go through with their leadership team. So yeah, we did one with JD on what it means to be a multiplying church. Of course, the one with you, Dave, on being an outwardly looking church, serving your community, and a host of other great teachers. It is to equip that pastor to lead some very strategic, important conversations at their church with their leaders. And so those on-demand courses are available, at Right Now Pastors Plus.
Yeah. So
Right Now is the king of great locations because we had me film mine in an old prairie church that was part of the original Great Awakening, like these little churches that were just thrown up back when Wesley was like, we got to multiply. So I imagine the other speakers. So it's worth it just for the scenery, just to watch these things.
That's great.
All right. So Thank you, Brian. Thank you, JD. Also, thank you, Warren Bird, who made a special guest appearance.
Ghost Warren.
And we're looking forward to seeing all of you next time we do a webinar together at one of our exponential events. So, all right. Goodbye, everybody.